Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another deep dive into another Pioneer deck. This time we are taking a look at Rakdos Midrange, just the midrange version, not the artifact version that has popped up from time to time. As a friendly reminder, if you do like informative Pioneer content, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. So red-black midrange, or Rakdos Midrange, is kind of the fun piece of the format, the kind of mid-range deck du jour of what you want to be playing in the format. It's very efficient at answering threats out of especially decks like Winota and such, and can often take on the role of the aggressive deck against control decks and such. To that end, it does play a lot of very powerful threats, whether you're playing Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger out of the graveyard to drain your opponent of resources, whether you're playing Blood-Tide Harvester as a 3/2 for 2 mana, or with the ability to gun down creatures, especially with one of the other cards we'll talk about here in a second. Graveyard Trespasser is allow you to have a little bit of graveyard interaction. Well, it often has to be a 2-for-1 when your opponent's killing it, if they're not using blockers to kill it. Bone Crusher Giant, just the nature of it being an adventure creature, being a shock on one side, and being a 4/3 body that requires your opponent to take 2 damage whenever you go to kill it. And then you have access to Kalida's Trader of Get as kind of your top end against other creature decks. This can grow exponentially large against other creature decks, whether it's Winota, Mono Red Aggro, etc. And the lifelink can be very relevant in those racing situations. So, in addition to those threats, you do have a lot of answers and things like Thoughtseize and Fatal Push being among the most efficient answers for what they do in the format. Obviously, you cannot always trigger Fatal Push in terms of the Revolt ability, but with Fable the Mirror Breaker and a few other things like Kroxa leaving the battlefield, etc., or sacrificing blood tokens from your harvesters and such, giving you a little bit of card selection, also triggering Revolt for your Fatal Pushes. And then you play other removal to pair with that. Blood Chief's Thirst is one of the chief ones. This allows you to interact with cheaper creatures and planeswalkers early, while also kicking it in the later game to answer most threats. Dreadbore, kind of one of the better catch-alls in the format in terms of planeswalkers and creatures. 2 mana, kind of hard to beat that kind of efficiency, although not every deck can play it. And then you have Fable the Mirror Breaker, which is a card that ties the deck together. Its first mode, you put a threat on the battlefield. Its second mode allows you to kind of trade out cards that you don't want to have access to. A lot of the problems with mid-range decks is oftentimes you'll be stuck with answers in hand, especially against say you're playing against a control deck and you have a couple of Fatal Pushes in hand, or you're flooding out and you have a land and a Fatal Push, allows you to cash in those for possibly other threats. And then the back end obviously becomes a reflection of Kiki-Jiki, which you do have some amount of threats, whether it be Blood-Tide Harvester to gun down your opponent's creatures, Graveyard Trespasser to really work on your opponent's graveyards, as well as being a resilient threat, or just Bone Crusher Giant hitting them with a 4/3 every turn. There's a lot of different things you can do with Reflection of Kiki-Jiki. This is one of the few decks that I've seen running this card in a lot of situations that has a lot of different elements that they can add to the deck. Then finally at the top end, you're running some over Planeswalkers. This one's choosing to run Sorin, which obviously allows you to put battlefield presence with the vampires, as well as looking at the top card and kind of doing the Dark Confidant-esque. If you look at the top card and you're willing to take some damage, you can draw it, and then its loyalty, or its ultimate, often can win the game as you've done your chip shots with your man lands or your creatures. Oftentimes 13 damage will be enough to do it. And then Chandra, kind of your top end threat. This allows you to answer your opponent's creatures. It also allows you to get a little bit of head on mana, so sometimes you can play this and then turn around and play a removal spell that turn, like say a Stomp from a Bone Crusher Giant, often getting ahead, while also being a card advantage engine with the exile abilities. And then the Emblem just threatens to end the game very quickly if you happen to get to that point. One of the powerful things about playing 2-color decks, as we've already mentioned in this format, is your lands get to do a lot of things. So in addition to playing all the dual lands, you get to play Castle Locthwain, which allows you to draw cards in the mid to late game, Den of the Bugbear, and Hive of the Eye Tyrant as threats, and then Takenuma, which allows you to rebuy some of your creatures or planeswalkers in the mid to late game. Crucible of Defiance, I'm still not going to try to pronounce the first word, allows you to put some threats into play. And then overall, just kind of tie it all together with very powerful threats and removal. Sideboards, we'll take a look at a couple different lists as far as things going on. Damping Sphere, this is primarily here for Nykthos and Lotus Field especially. Both of those decks can be a bit tricky as they can kind of go over the top of what you're doing, and they often don't care about your 1-for-1 removal. And while Thoughtseize can disrupt them, if given enough time, they will recover from that, so it's nice to have a permanent base disruption. Kolaghan's Command, this is just kind of a nice catch-all against any type of artifacts you might run into, whether it be out of the Karn lists or any type of other artifacts you might run into, while also being a grindy card against control and other mid-range decks, allowing you to rebuy threats, shatter, shock, whatever the mode you might be, or rebuy creatures from the graveyard. Go Blank, this is quite nice as both a two-step thing. It allows you to answer graveyards such as, out of the Mardu Greasefang decks or out of Phoenix, while also allowing you to kind of get rid of cards from your opponent's hand, relevant against both the combo decks and the control decks in the format. Noxious Grasp, one of a myriad of removal spells you can play. You'll see a lot of your removal spells are geared towards the removal of Winota in particular. This card is no exception from that, while also being able to answer annoying planeswalkers like Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Legion's Landing, I'm not 100% sure this is for, but mostly probably likely for the Lords of the Ground aggro decks, whether it be mono red, whether it be the Boros aggressive decks, whether it be against some portion of Winona, although it doesn't hit the namesake card. Feed the Swarm. One thing that this color combination is vulnerable to is enchantments, as there are very few ways to remove enchantments in black and red. So Feed the Swarm does give you the ability to remove a problematic enchantment while also being a removal spell. It does cost you a little bit of life. Raven Feeblement, once again, Winota, and then Duresses are pretty much geared towards the combo and control decks that you will be facing off. As once again, you are kind of the Swiss Army knife of the format, and in the post-board games, you want to be able to bring in cards that kind of answer what your opponent's doing. Taking a look at this version, not really a lot of different in the main deck. One card I wanted to point out was Hazoret the Fervent. One of the things that Rakdos is blessed with is it has a number of very efficient and very powerful threats, which is something that mid-range decks are often struggling to find, is the right balance of threats to pair with their answers. When you're already rocking Thoughtseize and Fatal Push, you're already a pretty good start against a lot of decks. Then Dreadbore allowing you to answer Planeswalkers. It's nice to be able to customize your threat base as you're trying to get a little bit more aggressive or a little bit more resilient as you're kind of facing off against different decks in the format. As far as the sideboard, a little bit different than this time around. You have Unlicensed Hearse, which is kind of an anti-graveyard thing that we mentioned, very similar to Go Blank, but this allows you to kind of pair it with that along with your Graveyard Trespassers. So this really allows you to attack your graveyard, whether it be against the various Greasefang decks or against the Phoenix decks, which are the primary graveyard decks of the format at this point. Power Word Kill as supplemental removal spells. This does kill most of the major threats in the format, although I'm sure there are a few non-demon, non-angel things. As the Angels deck was popping up for a bit, this deck will not be very good against that, but against a lot of the other threats you want to kill in the format. Most of them are humans or werewolves, so it's not the worst removal spell. Kolaghan's Command, once again, grinding card that's also pretty good against artifacts. Go Blank, we've already mentioned, this is pretty good against the various combo and control decks in the format. Liliana, when you want an additional grindy card in matchups, this forces each player to discard cards. It can be a removal spell or an emblem that basically allows you to put infinite creatures from your graveyard into play. Then Sky Sovereign, this one's probably pretty much here for the creature matchups, being able to go over the top, as most of your threats in the main deck will be able to crew this. So it's kind of a nice go over the top threat for any type of creature deck you might be running into. This one's a bit of an older list, but I did want to point it out to point out the different threats and stuff you can run in the deck. Strangle is one of the cards that popped up in the new set Streets of New Capenna. It's basically Bolt, sorcery speed Bolt, but for creatures or planeswalkers only. So very efficient threat, whether it's what you want to be in the format or not. Different story, but it's always nice to have more 1-mana removal. Tenacious Underdog is a 3/2 for 1 and a black, so it's a very efficient beater, while also having the Blitz ability to hit your opponent for 3 out of nowhere, also draw a card whenever it dies. And then you can cast Tenacious Underdog from your graveyard using its Blitz ability. Mainly this is used to pair with Nyxlis the Adversary, which was kind of the hyped card coming out of Streets of New Capenna for a lot of formats, whether it be Modern or Pioneer. This basically allows you to create 2 copies of Planeswalker whenever it comes into play if you control any number of creatures, which can be very problematic for a lot of decks, but what a lot of people have found with this card is it's very good in racing situations against non-creature decks. and it can be very good taxing against the control decks. But a lot of other decks just don't care. They kind of go over the top of what this is doing. If you don't have a board presence because you've had to sacrifice a creature, or if your opponent is a lower to the ground aggressive deck and you wasted your turn 2 and turn 3 casting a creature and then sacking it to Obnixilis, oftentimes they can just attack down your Obnixilises, and it, you really didn't gain a whole lot from it. Don't get me wrong, it's a very powerful effect, especially against the control decks if they don't have enough answers to Planeswalkers. But without ways to make additional copies, such as the Seeker's Chariot, as you'll see out of some of the Jund decks in the standard format right now, this is still a very powerful effect, but it's kind of faded in terms of some of the other cards that you've seen in these lists. And then obviously Kalida's still at the very top end of this list. Sideboard, Hitsugu, who consumes all. Seems okay. It's another graveyard hate card, while also being able to wipe out a bunch of 1-drops. While it's a very powerful card, this format is not as much dominated by 1-drops. So while it is powerful, it is kind of situational to what matchups you want to bring this in. Maybe if you're seeing a lot of the Boros, Prowess, and Burn decks, you might want to bring this. Or if it's you need additional graveyard hate pieces and don't want to play copies of Go Blank, it's a reasonable one. Especially when you get a threat out of it on the back end, which, it's fine. Whenever Vessel deals damage, put +1/+1 counter on it. Whenever Vessel all-consuming deals damage to a player, if it has dealt 10 or more damage to that player, they lose the game. Interesting effect, but once again, very situational, especially for 3 mana. Unlicensed Hearse, we've already talked about being pretty good against the Greased Fang and Phoenix decks, which have fallen off a little bit. Damping Sphere, obviously good against Lotus Field and Nykthos. Lava Coil, another removal spell you can play in these colors. Very importantly, it does Exile, which can be relevant in some spots. Noxious Grasp, as we've already talked about, pretty good against the Winota decks of the format, or anything rocking green, so also pretty good against Mono Green Devotion, allows you to knock out most of their Planeswalkers. Legion's End, we've already talked about, this can hit Mana Dorks and other smaller creatures. And then Duress, once again, you need a little bit more interaction for your opponent's hand. Final list I wanted to talk about is this one. It's a little bit different than some of the lists, and it was kind of I think this one's kind of been in between the lists that we've talked about. It does have one Obnixilis in the main, one Obnixilis in the sideboard. This is still a card that I think is worth testing, although it's proven to not be the most powerful in the format currently, the way it's structured. Tenacious Underdog, once again, you generally see these in the lists that have Obnixilis, as it's quite a nice pairing. While it is a relevant card, it is not necessarily the best thing to be doing in these slots if you're going for a non-Obnixilis build, but I often see these two paired together whenever you're playing them. Main deck, you're not seeing really a whole lot different in terms of cards. Most of these, they seem to have settled on 24 lands. The one of Fable Passage is kind of interesting to pair with Fatal Push, but most of the time you're seeing 4 Blood Crypt, 4 of the Pathways, 4 of the Haunted Ridges, and then some amount of basics and some amount of these different ability lands, whether it be the Crucial Blow Defense, Takanuma, Urborg. Generally you're seeing 1 Urborg and then just the rest of the lands filling in around it. The sideboard, the only new piece of tech that's in this one is Rending Volley. Obviously this card is very good against the Winota decks. It's also pretty decent against the blue-white control decks, and can also come in against the Izzet decks, especially to answer a threat like Thing in the Ice before it flips. And this player obviously did not like losing to combo and control with 4 copies of Duress. Overall, this is a very powerful and flexible deck as far as how to beat it. Oftentimes with a mid-range deck, you have to go over the top of it. That's why something like Mono Green Karn is so powerful, because oftentimes, while you can 1-for-1 them into the ground, all it takes is sometimes, say, a Storm the Festival or Cavalier of Thorns into something else, and oftentimes you just find yourself being unable to close out the game fast enough to disrupt what they're doing. And somewhat like blue-white control, you do find yourself in situations where you can't always answer everything. One of the things that the closest analog to red-black would be the old Jund decks in Modern. Those decks often paired the most efficient removal with the most efficient disruption and creatures, but as the format became more and more efficient overall, whether it was the blue-white control decks getting more powerful stuff, whether it was the aggressive decks getting more powerful things, or more powerful mid-range decks coming into the rogue, you really find yourself being outgunned by some of these decks. So, a deck like 5-color Bring to Light Niv or Mono Green Karn, there are certain decks that can kind of go over what this deck is doing. I do also believe, I'm not terribly familiar with it, so I can't say for sure, but I could also see the Lotus Field decks going over the top of what you're doing here. So, while this deck does have the tools to beat everything, oftentimes you'll find yourself struggling to beat one or two decks based on the configuration you bring to a particular tournament or a particular setting. So, this is kind of all the classic 50-50 deck. You can beat anything you want to beat, but you're going to give up points against other parts of the format. Now, what this deck is primarily built for is beating decks like Winota. So sometimes a deck like Burn can get you a little bit because, while you're geared to stop the creatures are still going to get a little bit of chip shot damage in. And eventually, if you don't have a Kalitas, especially in the early game, you're going to run into situations where your opponent can potentially burn you out. So there are ways to attack these decks, but once again, it has the tools to beat almost anything it wants to beat. Depends on the pilot, depends on the list. This is one of the more flexible and powerful decks in the format, but it can be overpowered. Traditionally, to beat mid-range, you go bigger with a mid-range deck, like 5-color Niv, like the Mono Green Karn decks. So that's kind of how you attack the deck, how you attack it in the format, and kind of where its place in the format is primarily because it's such a great foil to Winota, and a lot of the other top decks just cannot match up to Winota particularly well. So, kind of Rakdos' place in the format. If Winota were to fall away, I think the Rakdos would be a little bit weaker, but I still think it would be a relevant deck in the format. Easily tier 2, tier 1.5, tier 2 for most of it, especially when it has one of the most efficient spells in Thoughtseize and one of the most efficient removal spells in Fatal Push. So it's kind of hard to go wrong from there, and it just depends on how you want to build around that. So, as always, this has been John for Pioneer Nexus MTG with Rakdos Midrange and kind of a deep dive into that particular deck in the format.